Right. So I will cut to the chase and start with the questions right away. First of
All
all,
right.
even though it's probably expected of me to start with the questions about the Stonewall riot, I'd like to circle back to that a little bit later. And what I'd like to focus on right now is the first ever gay liberation march, Christopher Street Liberation March, that you, among other people, participated in, organized, and marched in. What I never quite managed to grasp reading about it, what was the atmosphere like on the first ever gay pride in NYC?
Well, the first gay pride, it was a year-long process. It was Craig Rodwell's idea. Do you know Craig?
Yeah.
Okay. So it was Craig Rodwell's idea. Right after the riots had ended, I was working in the bookshop with him. That was the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop. And that was the first LGBT bookshop in the world. And we had planned on closing because it was an event that was called the Annual Reminder at what's known as Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And the shop was so busy back then. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have cell phones or anything like that. So people would come into the shop to get information. So instead of going to that annual reminder, and that was supposed to be my first one, I stayed in the shop, and Craig went down there, and he told me before he left, this will be the last annual reminder. The annual reminder had been created 5 years before, again at Craig's suggestion, and the picket was conducted by New York Mattachine and Washington Mattachine. So it was that early that Craig knew that we needed to change what we were doing as far as picketing and make it more inclusive and bring more people into it, because the pickets were very regimented. The people in the picket line would wear, the men would wear suits, the women would wear dresses, and he wanted to change all of that so that it better reflected what the community was like then. So he left, he went down there, got into a tussle with one of the organizers over the fact that instead of marching single file, two women marched hand in hand. And one of the older organizers went over and slapped the women's hands and said, there'll be none of that. So Craig got into a shouting match with him, and that was the start of it being the end. So from there, we held meetings throughout the summer, trying to gauge how much interest there was for it, how much people would want to become involved in something like that. And there was, of course, a lot of interest. A lot of new groups had been forming right after Stonewall, and many of them wanted to participate in this, but everybody wanted to be in charge. And Craig said, no, this has got to be a collective effort, and we're all going to have to do this together. There's not going to be any one group that's in charge of the march. So in November of that year, 1969, we went to a conference in Philadelphia of the Eastern homophile organizations. And it was there that we made the proposal, myself, Craig, Ellen Broidy, and Linda Rhodes, that this march be held. And we had nearly unanimous support for it. The one group that didn't want to support it because they didn't want to be not in charge was the New York Mattachine Society. So they abstained rather than vote against it. Eventually, they came on board in April. But it was after then, going into December, January, that we started working on bringing the groups together. Most of the meetings were held in our apartment or at the bookshop. And we worked bringing these different groups together. When we finally got to the time of the march. Different people wanted to be at the head of the march, and Craig's solution was every group could send one person to the head of the march. And that's why you see a picture of me. I was there from our group. He was working, with dealing with the police and that sort of thing. So there was myself, Daughters of Bilitis, Gay Liberation Front, Student Homophile League, NYU, but so many groups. And so it was a very representative group at the front of the march, not one particular group.
What was, in your opinion, the biggest challenge in organizing the first Pride? Was it talking to the police? Was it organizing the community to march? Was it the march itself?
Well, a lot of it had to do with the differing opinions of what should be done. And what we tried to do was get people to work on their commonalities and set aside their differences. And that's why the march went so well in the beginning. I know in later years it changed and became more corporate.
What do you think?
Not be focused on their differences, but focused on this one thing that they could do together. That was what we worked on. With the police, they didn't give us a permit, and they dropped it.
I think I lost you for a second.
Okay.
Okay, you said with the police there was an issue of a permit?
Yes, we'd applied for a permit early on, and Craig and Michael Brown did most of the negotiating with the police, and they could not get them to agree that we would be able to hold the march. And we kept telling them there will be a march on that date. So, we'd like to do it with a permit, but if not, we would go ahead with the march anyway. So the morning of the march, they dropped the permit off at our apartment, and we went from there.
Wow. You mentioned something about prides today being very corporate, and that is one of the biggest criticisms of pride parades everywhere, including Serbia today, is that they're becoming more of a party and less of a political struggle, especially in countries like Serbia, where we still haven't won our political rights. What do you think about that, the prides today?
Well, I think what's happened is that the Pride marches are all working off the same model now, and they've gotten away from the roots. Craig, I left New York a couple of years later, and Craig was still involved in organizing the march. But the first inkling that he had that things were going wrong was when a business group in Greenwich Village came and said, we would like to have the march begin somewhere else and end in the village so that we get all the crowds there, and, for our businesses. And these businesses that were proposing that, they were the very businesses that we were demonstrating against at the time. They were mafia run, and they were paying off the police, and they were really part of the oppression of lesbian and gays. So when that change was made, Craig left the group. And as we know, it's developed more and more geared toward business, geared towards, focusing on things other than gay and lesbian liberation.
yeah, it became profit oriented, and it's in
Yes.
some instances it's not even gays and lesbians organizing the pride, which
Yeah.
I feel that it is happening today more and more, which is odd. And that's exactly at some point that the pride abandon its original principles. Does it did it in a way leave gays and lesbians out of the point of the pride itself?
Well, it's what we had was a march that when we went up the street, anybody could join. There were no barricades. There were very few cops. And it was just people. There were no floats. There were no go-go boys. There were none of that business that goes on now, which seems to become the center of it now. I went to a pride in New York, 5 or 6 years ago, and I was struck by not just how corporate it was, but how separated from the people it was. Everybody was on the sidelines behind barricades. It was not what we wanted at all.
Yeah,
We
when
wanted something that
sorry, continue.
we wanted something that people could join or leave or whatever they wanted to do, not something that had a structure where you had this float, that float, this group, that group. It was just a group of people en masse.
I had a same when I attended my first pride in Belgrade in 2014 and even 15 and 16. Stonewall and the first prides in New York City came to mind immediately because I would have to almost ask the police whether I can enter the march, which entirely demeans the purpose of the pride itself, because it was supposed to be people gathering. And that brings me to my next question, actually. I would like to know what the community meant back in the 60s and 70s, because I'm not sure I can understand it completely, because again, I'm not sure we can experience it now. I don't think we have it now in that sense. So what did the community mean?
The community was, remember back in the 1960s, in the US, the civil rights movement was going on. The anti-war movement was going on. And those are very big organizing efforts. And that gave gays and lesbians the opportunity to organize in a way that wouldn't have been possible a few years before. And while people are participating in things, it's more siloed now. Do you know what the expression silo?
No?
A silo is on a farm. You have a big grain facility that usually sits next to a barn. Well, that symbolizes how ideas can become siloed, in that they're just one particular thing, another particular thing. And there's so much of that now. Whereas back during the civil rights and anti-war era, while those were sort of silos themselves, there was a lot of intermingling of the different groups. We organized gay bus groups to go down to Washington for the moratorium, which was unheard of then, for a bus just to be for gay people. Like there were fundraising efforts for the Black Panthers, and we participated in that fall before the march. So there was a lot of commingling of efforts that I don't think you see so much today. Today, everybody is really in their silos.
Mm-hmm. Like identity politics on steroids, like everybody's in their own.
That's right.
Have you seen the movie Pride? You probably have. 2014. It's about the lesbians and gays supporting minors in UK in 1984. That's, for me, that's the point of LGBT organizing, or any kind of minority organizing, that we can actually support each other, and not only fighting for our own set of interests, because we can never win if we're not, if there is power in the union, as it was said.
Right.
But
Well, it was a mixed thing. One of the discussions that went on for the first Pride was a large group of people wanted it to be a citywide effort with other radical organizations. And we said, no, this is something that we have to stand alone on, so that we can show, we can certainly work with other groups, but we have to show that we can do this ourselves. And that's the way it's turned out. I don't think you see Pride really reaching out today to much more than I don't know, fetishes sometimes, when you look at the marches. And that isn't what the march was meant to be.
yeah, it feels as if it was appropriated by this idea of queer community, where queer can mean straight as well, or it can just mean people into kink, which kind of brings straight people into our fight and diminishes the idea of the, and that actually brings me to what I wanted to ask you is, how has the situation changed now that it's 50 years since the first Pride, and then we have organizations like Stonewall, named after the Stonewall riots, that have had a big shift in their ideology and a big shift in their priorities while fighting for LGBT rights? How does that look like to you now?
Well, it seems most of the groups, and like GLAAD in the US, they no longer use the term lesbian in their name. They just use the acronym. So lesbians have been erased from the discussion. And that was part of the reason why a year and a half ago, I started to get involved in this, because knowing the history as I did, I was seeing a different history being told, and it wasn't anything even close to what happened. Women were very central to what happened to create the first groups, the first Pride. And the way the story's told now, it was trans women of color that did everything. And that's just not true. It didn't happen that way.
Let's then circle back to what actually happened at the Stonewall, and what the current story pushed by mainstream LGBT media is. What there is, like, people are claiming that there is this big debate on who started the Stonewall riots, as if we don't know, as if it's just some sort of mystery and we will never know who actually started it, but we do know. So who started the Stonewall riots?
Well, when we got there, we were on our way home from dinner, and we could see a group that was gathered in front of the bar. It was a small group at that point, maybe 20 men. And we asked what was going on. They said, oh, there's another police raid going on. And they knew that there had been some sort of disturbance inside, which was normal for a raid. Usually in a raid, you get people that are very afraid, and so they make a dash for the door. They get stopped. They get, shoved up against the wall, that sort of thing. So we knew that was going on. But then a paddy wagon, which is what they would load prisoners in, it's like a van, pulled up, and the door opened, and they started bringing the prisoners out. And there were a couple of drag queens, and then a woman whose name is Stormy DeLarave. She was about 5-6 feet away from me. I was right by the back of the van. And she was struggling with the police officers and said, why don't you guys do something? And that's when the riot started. So if anybody started the riot, it was Stormy.
Right. And what kind of narrative are we getting right now? How did it get so twisted that right now we hear that Marsha Johnson and Sylvia Rivera started everything, Stormy is nowhere to be heard of? How did that happen?
I don't know how it happened, but they were uh, Johnson and Rivera were they were street workers, and they were drug addicts. And one thing you know from dealing with those people is that they generally lie about everything and try to center themselves. And they told a number of different lies. One of the lies was that they were both in the bar celebrating Marsha's birthday. Well, Marsha's birthday is in August, not in June. So, you know, the lies quickly fell apart. And eventually they fell out a little bit with each other because Marsha started saying, you know, you weren't even there. And we now know that Sylvia Rivera was passed out from doing drugs on a park bench up in Bryant Park behind the New York Public Library, nowhere near the Stonewall. Never showed up that night. And Marsha Johnson didn't get there till almost an hour into it. As she was quoted saying, when she got there, the bar was already on fire. So for some reason, the story has developed in a way that people see that there's something more interesting, I guess, than just the fact that it was a group of men and a few women at the bar at that time that started the riot, not a bunch of drag queens. There was I don't know if you've heard the story, a kick line where, you know, a group of drag queens did, you know, kind of like a line in a cabaret, and they were doing kicks and singing songs. That lasted all of 5 minutes. It was a minuscule part of what happened. But now that's been centered as, oh, it was the drag queens that led this. They didn't lead anything. Nobody would follow a drag queen. I mean, people don't follow drag queens now. So why would they do that then, when drag queens were even more marginalized then than they are today? I mean, now I know they have TV shows for them and that sort of thing. But back then, they were on the very edges of gay society, and we would not follow them. They weren't involved in any of their organizations, other than they might show up at a meeting. But as far as showing any leadership or showing any initiative on what should be done, they weren't a part of that.
So what it seems to right now, for people who are trying to get in touch with the LGBT history today, young people, it seems that the only women who were fighting the fight and who were on the first lines of the riots were not lesbians, were drag queens that we are now pretending are women, because I've been reading a lot about Marsha Johnson as well. And I've read a lot of his interviews saying that he's an out and proud gay man doing drag. But at some point it got twisted into saying that he is a transgender woman. So now that when we're thinking about women in LGBT history, we are thinking about trans women, and lesbians are getting erased from our history entirely.
Yeah, the first night of rioting, it was mostly men. There were some women, but it was a male area. The women's bars, the few bars that there weren't in that area. But when the word got out of what happened the first night, the second night, women poured out in droves, and they were an equal part of the crowd. Some of the people that you know today that were instrumental in that time, Martha Shelley, Flavio Rondo, they were all people that showed up that second night, and we don't hear about them today. You know, we were doing leafleting, and nobody hears about that any longer. We were out with leaflets asking for more demonstrations. We didn't realize it would turn into another riot, but we wanted a demonstration in front of the I can send you a copy of one of the leaflets that we sent. You might be interested in that.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay.
But yeah, even when, for example, I've been also reading that Stormé was portrayed as a he by, I think, Harper's Bazaar or some sort of media. So now we even have proud lesbians being post-mortem transed into transgender trans men.
Right, and that piece that you're referring to was written by a transgender person. It was not written by a historian. It was written by somebody who was trying to shape the narrative, as opposed to talking about history. If you look at Stormé's history, and she was well known in the village. I didn't know her, but she was well known, and well known for decades afterwards. And she never identified as a man. She did a drag act.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I think I've lost you again.
No. The video is frozen, but I can hear you. Or no? 1 second.
We're back.
We're back. So she did a drag act as well in the village?
Yeah, it was part of a performance that she would do, but that didn't make her a trans male. But this person who never knew her wrote this piece for Harper's or whatever publication it was, never knew her, never interviewed her, never interviewed any of her friends. They just made up a story because they're trying to continue this narrative that everyone was trans. It's even happened to me on Twitter. I was told by somebody that my attitude shows that I have this deep-seated, unresolved gender dysphoria, and if I would only come to terms with it, I'd be okay. It's bizarre.
It is.
I can't strike anybody as trans. That's take one look at me.
Yeah, but like after I've read that about Stormé, I also read on Velvet Chronicles, I think it was Julia Robertson, she wrote quite a bit, and she actually was in touch with you, and you spoke a lot about women in the movement. So thank you for that, and thank you for preserving the history that is now under the attack. So let's try to see what's actually happening with the state of the LGBT movement right now. So basically, what we have is we have Pink News, we have Stonewall UK, and that's the mainstream LGBT activism today. What we now have the alternative. Obviously, we have LGBT Alliance, and now there's this beginning of this new media, lesbian and gay news, that is supposed to be some sort of alternative to the mainstream news. So how do you feel about new shifts in the movement today?
Well, just like with Pride, the movement went from being a movement of ideas to being corporate. And today, much of what the groups do, whether it's Stonewall UK or the Human Rights Campaign, it's all about raising money. Mm-hmm. And the money right now comes from, well, one of the big donors is a billionaire by the name of Pritzker, a trans woman. And she does a lot of funding for groups. And we're talking about very big money. Have you heard of drag queen story time?
No. Oh yeah, it was in schools, right?
Yeah, and that's something else that's funded. There's the it's like mermaids, Stonewall UK. They make huge amounts of money, and the money is coming to them from these sources now. It's where the most money is, so they go to the money. One of the things that I was able to find in doing research is that many of the hospital organizations here in the United States that operate transgender clinics, they're actually funding groups so that they can bring more people in for treatment.
Right.
Again, it's about the money. And the old story about the Watergate years was follow the money. And if you follow the money here, you'll see that drug manufacturers are making huge amounts of money, but through hormones, not just hormones, but the treatments that become necessary, lifelong treatments that people have to have because they make this mistake early in life. And they get surgery. The surgeries are abominable. The after effects are terrible, and they're lifelong. They have medical needs that, if they were just treated for this dysphoria, they wouldn't have these kinds of expenses. And of course, it's the drug companies and the hospitals that are making such huge amounts of money now. And, we never even heard of this back then. There was no discussion about trans women because nobody knew what that was. But now that's the center of the movement.
Right, and I've been following that more in Europe. I'm more familiar with what's happening in UK and the Tavistock Clinic and the Kira Bell case and everything. But one of the main issues that we are facing right now is the mass transing of young gays and lesbians, and even some parents admit to doing that to their kids, which is homophobic, and the world is pretending to be blind while the new form of conversion therapy is being born.
That's right. That's absolutely right. If who knows what would have happened to me if I had been born, 20 years ago? What would I be doing now? What pressures I would have felt that I didn't feel 50, 70 years ago.
Yeah. I'm often thinking about the same thing about me. And while I'm following mainstream LGBT organizations in Serbia, that bear in mind that Serbia still doesn't have same-sex marriage legalized, but we have mainstream organizations that are perpetuating this queer theory ideas. Starting with trans women started Stonewall riots, and also offering hormones to minors illegally, obviously. So this whole debate is very much alive in the countries that still haven't fought for the basic rights, which would be like safety in the streets or same-sex marriage and so on. But
just get this out here. This is a book that if you haven't read it, you should read it.
Right.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
It's by David Carter,
Right.
He passed away last year. He's a historian, and it is the definitive book about the riots. It's the full title is Stonewall: The Riots That Sparked the Gay Revolution. And another book, if you can locate it, would be this one.
The Politics of Homosexuality. Yeah.
Right. Like Toby Murata. That's harder to get. But those two books have so much of the detail of the history of that time. And there are a couple of others that I could recommend, like the Gay Militants by Don Teal. He was one of the participants in the riot, and he ended up writing a book about it. So there are histories that we can go to that Toby's was a little more contemporaneous, as well as Don Teal's. David Carter's, he spent, I guess he started in the early 90s working on it. And he's a researcher and a fact checker. And he started working on it, and he interviewed hundreds of people. And the people that you don't really see in these books are Marsha Johnson, Sylvia Rivera. You don't see them, but you'll read about the story of Stormy.
Yeah.
So we need to rely more on historians than organizations, because I think the organizations are no longer trustworthy. What they do is geared towards raising money, and they'll change the story to develop a revenue source. And that's what's been going on with the trans business.
Right. And that's, I mean, all the organizations have some sort of agenda, and exactly as you said, if you follow the money, we can figure out who's funding said agenda, and that's how we get this massive historical revisionism happening around Stonewall. And it's actually bizarre how many people they have managed to convince into all of this, as if there is no way to actually find out what truly happened.
Well, there were only a half a dozen or so people whose names are mentioned. And early on, when I started doing this, people who were supporting that idea would shout a name out to me. And I said, I never heard of that person. So I started doing research. And then I found that one of the people that they cite ran out the door and went home and never came back. Another person that they cite as being one of the people who instigated the riot actually was arrested and cried to the police and said, if my mother sees me, sees my picture, I'll never live it down. So the cop just waved her off, and she never came back. So the people whose names they throw out just as a name that's been put on Wikipedia and that has no real story behind it. But if you do look at the stories and the information is there, you'll find that these people played no role, and they certainly played no role in the organizing that went on during the riots. People like Michael Brown, Craig Rodwell, these were the people that organized during the riots, that put together meetings, that created Gay Liberation Front. So, these people that they keep referring to, they played no role. And I've said this many times, we owe them nothing.
Right. Like, one of the first accounts of, so basically when you found out that this has become a thing, that these fake stories and completely made up history is being told by some organizations and media, you started writing Twitter Sunday threads on various important people, and that's how actually I figured out that you're active again. So was for you Twitter the original a place where you could actually tell the story again? Was how did you
I just fell into it. By the way, I was suspended from Twitter
I know, I
a
saw
week
that.
ago.
What was that about?
Yeah. I got it. Well, I got into an argument with a women's group, and it had to do with who they were working with. I've had a difference of opinion as far as how we should approach working with the Biden administration and that sort of thing. And they don't want to talk, they want to dictate, which is sort of like what we hear from the transgender groups. They just tell you what you're to believe. So, I looked at the group and I looked at what they had done, and I found out that they were working just a couple of years ago with a group called Focus on the Family, which you probably never heard of. They've been around for more than 40 years. They are one of the most homophobic groups that's ever existed in the US. They were the group that they spun off a couple of other different groups, the Family Research Council, which again tells lies about the gay community and gay people. The Life Site News is one of their online organizations. And so I confronted the group with this, and I said, who are you to tell me anything? I've never worked with a homophobe. I won't work with a homophobe. You've worked with a homophobe. You've filed in court with homophobes. And they said, well, they're conservative. I said, no, they're not conservative. They're homophobes. And there's no getting around that point. It's like, I couldn't believe that we'd gotten to the point where people that were working in our groups were working with homophobes to bring down trans people. I think there are a lot of issues that have to be addressed, but I don't think that destroying another group is the way to go about it. One of the things that they supported was governmental discrimination. I've opposed governmental discrimination all of my life. I remember what the 60s were like for Black people. Certainly what those times were like for gay people. And when the government has its hand in it, it's always bad. It always comes out bad. And so that's not the way I want to see us going about doing this. I think we have to communicate with trans people, but I don't think discriminating against them is the way to do it. Particularly, we individually, we discriminate. We make decisions about who we'll sleep with, who we'll go out to dinner with, but that's on an individual level. When the government becomes involved, it's bad. Whether it was, the Soviet Union saying who should be involved, who should not be involved, or the French government does that to some extent as far as discriminating against nationalities. So those things have always troubled me. And the better way to go at it is for people to work on the problem together.
Yeah, I agree. I still believe that even though there are some conflicts of interest between transgender groups and LGBT rights, it is still very much
Absolutely.
that we find not necessarily a compromise, but like a common solution that will not trump over women's rights, also not trump over gay rights of gays and lesbians, but actually figure out a system where we can all
That's right. When I was saying before about working with homophobes, you can't work with homophobes because their only goal is to put you down, make you a criminal. So there never is going to be an agreement. But I think, and do you know Debbie Hayton?
Yeah.
She's a transgender.
Mm.
You know, there are plenty of fine transgender people that I had as followers on Twitter that don't subscribe to what's being done today. And those are the people that we can work together with. But we can't work with the absolutists. Like this women's group, they're very much an absolutist group. And in fact, I was in a meeting and I was trying to speak about how to talk about things. And I was shouted down, no, no, no. And so I stopped talking because I don't want to get into a shouting match with people. But that to me, that's not collegial.
But circling back to Twitter, for example, Twitter has some weird policies right now where you can, for example, support pedophilia, but God forbid if a woman stands up for her sex-based rights. So what we are seeing is many,
Right.
including lesbians, being kicked out of the platform, and yet we have far-right organizing on Twitter.
That's right. And one of the things with Twitter is when you look at the administration of Twitter, one of the top people at Twitter is transgender. Lost you there.
Yeah, lost you as well.
There we go.
You're back.
One of the top people at Twitter is an engineer who's transgender. And so that's why their policies are guided the way they are, because they're woke, as the expression goes. And woke people don't allow for a multitude of thoughts. They only want one thought, their thought. And that's why Twitter operates the way it does.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also a corporation, so.
Yeah.
So one more thing, I wanted to ask you what would you say to young people today fighting, in a sense, fighting both fights at the same time, as I believe in some way we are right now. So fighting old school homophobia, so fighting for actual rights, both legislative, such as same-sex marriage, and also like basic security in the streets, but also fighting this war with the gender identity politics.
Well, the first thing I would tell them is learn your history. Know where we came from. Because if you buy into what's being said now, you're not going to get it right. You're going to be confused. It's the whole reason why the history is being told the way it is now, to confuse people. So learn your history, know it well, so that you can respond. And you'll be able to progress from there just by knowing where you came from.
Thank you for still defending our history in the midst of new homophobia and new historical revisionism that is happening. I hope to see you back on Twitter soon.
Well, I doubt that's going to happen.
Luckily,
I'm on Facebook. I'm on Facebook now.
Oh, lovely. Luckily, I have a lot of your threads screenshotted, so it's not lost. A lot of people do, so everything you've written is not lost.
Oh, geez. I didn't realize.
Is there anything else that you would like to add since we're close to the end?
It's nice to see young people like yourself getting so deeply involved. I can remember being in the same place and being driven by the same feelings of having to do more. And it's so good to see that. So thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, thank you for this, and thank you very much for everything you have done. It means a lot to young people to actually see to actually be it means actually a lot to me right now to be able to talk to you about everything, because you are a person that I've been reading about in articles and history books, and here you are talking to me.
Don't believe what you see in pink news.
If I believed it, would I be here on this Zoom chat?
Right. Yeah. Well, this has been very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you as well. I will stop the recording right now.